So the paper presenting today and the research that it incorporates is really looking at occupational mobility, and there's a little bit of stuff about the effect that might have on wages at the end. And the context that we're sort of interested in occupational mobility is in the idea that the structure of the labour market has changed in terms of what jobs there are, which ones have grown, which ones have declined, and what effect that might have on career paths and mobility more broadly. And the part of the sort of change in the occupational structure that captures policymakers' attention most is the idea that there's been a kind of continual growth in high-skill, high-wage jobs. And I've taken here a quote from the government's strategy document on social mobility that was published in April. And they talk about there being room at the top. So as there are increasingly more and more qualified new labour market entrants, there are jobs for these people to move into. There's space for those skills to be used. Now, the explanation for why there might be this growth in high-skill, high-wage jobs is debated. One factor that we think is important on this is the level of technology, particularly the take-up of computerized capital. And as the level of that changes in firms and in the labour market, in the economy, some jobs are complementary to the take-up of this capital, and some jobs are replaced by this capital. And as a result, some grow and expand, and more people find working those jobs, and some decline, and people have to move away from them. Now, there's sort of two views on where these complementarities or substitutabilities might occur. The one that's sort of dominated for a large part of the last 2 decades, at the very least, is the idea of skill-biased technical change. So that when there is technical progress, it is people who are doing high-skill jobs that benefit. They become more productive, and firms want to employ more and more of these people. And it is low-skill jobs that are replaced. And that's a view that's sort of been within policy and academic discussion for at least until the middle of the last decade. The paper I've noted here by author Levy and Murnane has a slight twist on this. They say it is not skills that are complementary or substitutable with technology, but it's the tasks performed by jobs. And they divide between what they call routine tasks and non-routine tasks. A routine task is one that is easily substitutable with technology. It doesn't necessarily mean low-skill, mundane, repetitive work, but it means something that you could write down a list of instructions, and then you could program something like a computer to do that job later on. Where non-routine tasks, you can't do that. It's the opposite. And Goose and Manning, in a paper originated in 2003, was published in 2007, points out these routine occupations tend to be actually middle-wage jobs, and non-routine fall into 2 categories. They're the high-wage, high-skill jobs, and they're low-wage, low-skill jobs. This leads to the kind of hollowing out of the labour market, sometimes referred to the hourglass labour market, or to the polarisation of the labour market. Now, the full implications of a polarised labour market have never really been considered properly, certainly by policymakers, in terms of what that means for mobility. The focus is very much on the good side of that, the growth in the high-skill jobs, and the potential for creating winners, people who are going to do better in the labour market as a result. And there's very little focus on the possible sort of losers in the labour market. And here we're going to talk about 3 people who might possibly lose out from this change. Firstly, those who are who end up losing their jobs or end up moving out of routine jobs because of this process of technical change. And some of those do move up, but there are, of course, people who might move down to low-wage, low-skill, non-routine jobs, tend to be in the service sector of service occupations. Secondly, there's people who are coming into the labour market that is increasingly polarised. And they maybe would have in the past gone into routine jobs, somewhere in the middle, and they're now finding those opportunities don't exist as much, so the question is where they end up. And finally, there are people who are in jobs right at the bottom of the market, and their potential paths for upward mobility become more difficult if the jobs in the middle are declining. Presumably people can't make massive leaps in the labour market, they make small steps, and if there are fewer jobs above you, it makes, it sort of bottlenecks. And the other thing that we're sort of interested here is this idea that there has been a definite sort of polarisation in job titles, occupations. There's been big growth in managerial jobs, big growth in technician class jobs, a small growth in professional level jobs. And as well as at the bottom, sort of service sector, service occupation jobs. It's a lot less obvious, this polarisation, when you start to look at wages. There's not been a massive growth in high wage and low wage work. A lot of work still tends to be in the middle. It's just what the occupational title for that has changed. So the question is, are the people who are winners actually winning a huge amount in terms of higher rewards for moving into these apparently good non-routine occupations? We use two data sources, predominantly focus on the National Child Development Study. Those who may or may not be familiar with it, this is a cohort study. It started in 1958. It takes waves of data occasionally, normally every 5 or 10 years. It has been over the last 3 decades. So we get pictures of where people have been working, what their earnings have been, how qualified they are at points in time. And we use between 1981 and 2004 to 2005 to get a picture of these people's adult working lives. Part of the work, we also use a British cohort study, and this is a later study, and so we can use this to compare a younger and an older cohort and their experiences in the labour market. Here's a little something about how there's a problem when you're looking at occupations that you've got different ways of classifying them, and that's just a technical challenge. The key thing here is that once I've got all this occupational data, we tend to turn that into occupational groups. And each individuals are placed into one of 6 groups. We have professional, managerial, intermediate level. These are high wage, at least our priors are, these are high wage, high skill, non-routine occupations. Service and manual non-routine are low wage, low skill, non-routine occupations, and routine are the ones that we think starting in the middle. And there are 3 questions we look at in this paper. The technical thing is that we're using a logic model. This is basically a way of predicting the probabilities of being in different parts of the labour market in different occupations, and how that can be explained by individual differences in qualification levels, labour market experiences, and other factors we may want to throw in. So the first thing we look at is how individuals have moved out of routine occupations to other occupational groups, and what can explain those moves, and whether we predict just a probability of moving upwards and very little moving downwards, or whether there are some people in these routine occupations who are being kind of forced down. And I use up and down here to mean the high wage and low wage non-routine occupations. Just that's purely by the occupational title. The second thing we're looking at is to compare across the 2 cohorts about where people start in the labour market. Now the idea here is that as some of these routine occupations are in decline, and maybe the wage rewards to those jobs, or the wage rewards to the skills used by those jobs face sort of downward pressures, you would expect to see new entrants avoiding those jobs and finding work elsewhere. Their investment in the time or the skills to perform those jobs is no longer as useful. And so maybe they would move to either side of the non-routine occupational groups. And the final thing, we want to link some of this occupational mobility to what's happening with wages. We look at the high wage, high skill, non-routine occupations, and we look to see whether there's any effect of moving into that job from a different occupational group on your earnings compared to somebody who's maybe doing that job for most of their working life. I have a slide on results for each of those. I've omitted most of the technical side of it just to kind of focus on the actual results. For the first part, looking at what's happened to these displaced routine occupation workers, we're able to separate out between kind of career effects. We know that people tend to move upwards over the course of their life, and the effects that are coming about because the amount of jobs in routine occupations versus non-routine occupations is changing. And we want to split those 2 out to get an idea about the effect of occupational structure on mobility. Obviously, we, as you would expect to find, we see that some qualifications tend to lead to more upward mobility, although that isn't systematically true across all qualifications. In particular, vocational qualifications below level 4 don't appear to improve the probability of moving from a routine occupation to a good non-routine occupation. There's very little difference in our analysis between academic qualifications at level 2 and 3 in terms of your probability or your likelihood of moving to a better job. Experience within a routine occupation makes you less mobile. That's sort of makes sense. People who've been doing a routine job for 15 years have got a lot more to lose if they end up moving to something else. Age, so people get less mobile as they get older. Again, something we would expect to find. So we take all those things to one side, and then we look purely what's happening with the occupational structure. We find here that the decline in routine jobs both increases mobility upwards to managerial and intermediate level positions, and it also increases mobility downwards. There are some people who are losing their routine jobs and being pushed into service sector, service occupation jobs which earn lower wages. Now there are some effects, so there's some differences here by then qualification level. So I have illustrative numbers just to kind of show, but there's probably not time to go through all this table. But the basic idea here is that more qualified people tend to do better when they're displaced, separate from all the career effects. If there's a period of time where lots of routine jobs are being lost, the most qualified people tend to find themselves moving upwards, and the less qualified people are less likely to do that. The flip side of that is, in terms of downward mobility, qualifications don't seem to make any difference whatsoever. There are a number of people each year who are sort of pushed out of routine jobs into low-wage, non-routine jobs, and they could be fairly high qualified or not particularly high qualified. There's no sort of difference in that group. That was from the displacement side. Then we looked at the early employment, of individuals. And as we expect to find, the younger cohort is a lot less likely to go into routine occupations early in their working life. And they're also, these individuals are more qualified, and we find a link between qualifications and the probability of being in a routine occupation. So both these factors mean that there are less young people in these routine occupations. And there's an increased probability of being in service occupations, low-wage non-routine occupations, and there's not really any effect on being in a managerial position. But all those two things combined don't actually explain enough change in the early employment of the younger cohort. We would expect to see a lot more people from this younger cohort avoiding routine occupations, and there's still quite a large proportion going to these routine occupations, even if they have higher skills, and maybe expect to see them moving into intermediate or managerial positions earlier in their working life. So something here that's not being explained purely by human capital view. And I'm okay. Yeah. Okay. And the final part, we looked at differences in earnings for individuals moving into professional, managerial, intermediate occupations. And I have little stars here by the ones that are statistically significant. So to pull out a few things, for those people in managerial jobs, those who've come from a routine job or a service job systematically earn less. These scores are based on positions within the distribution. They're sort of decile scores, so it's a score of 1 to 10. So we see that for people moving into managerial jobs, there's a lower earning, half of a decile difference between those people moving into managerial jobs from a routine position and people who are already in managerial jobs. And it's even lower for people in service jobs. Now this could reflect a few things. It could reflect, this is all controlling for education differences. So this could reflect there are some unobserved skill differences that aren't captured by qualifications, and that's being reflected in their wages. Or it could reflect elements of the jobs that these people are actually going into, that there are a different sort of managerial job being created, or a different sort of intermediate job that's being created, and the people who are moving in from routine jobs are doing something slightly different. And that's not being captured just by looking at this big group of managerial or intermediate occupations. Okay, so as a conclusion, the development of the hourglass labour market does lead to increased upward mobility. So that's the room at the top part. So there is some room at the top, and there's definitely people moving into those jobs. However, it has also generated downward mobility, so there is room at the bottom. And in some cases, it's led to worse outcomes for new entrants. People who are coming into the labour market are doing worse than maybe they would have in the absence of all these occupational structure changes. Purely looking at qualifications as a way of explaining what's happening here, the evidence is sort of mixed. The more qualified are more upwardly mobile, but they're not less downwardly mobile for these occupational structure changes. And that suggests that there are some qualification, non-education, or human capital barriers that are in the way. And the more qualified people are going into entering the labour market in better jobs, but not the same degree as maybe we might expect. So again, there's some reasons to think, well, why are these more qualified individuals going to these jobs that we know are in decline? And there could be something to do there with sort of established career paths. We know people are going to these jobs because they think it leads to something else in the future. But this sort of mobility isn't explained just purely by differences in skills or education. And there's a difference if we look at wages or occupations when you come to saying who are the winners here. There are some people who have clearly moved into what we think of as being good jobs, but they're being penalised in terms of their wages when they actually get into those jobs. And there's a couple possible explanations for that, but that's something we need to look into further.